Right, should we try again? Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Times and Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival. For those of you that do not know, we are a charity festival that has education and community work right at the heart of what we do. Even this festival, just over 10 days, we have welcomed over 9,000 school children through our doors, and we thoroughly believe in inspiring minds. Of course, as a charity, we can't go deliver these amazing events and experiences for all unless we have our partners. So I'm delighted and I'm thankful to the University of Gloucestershire for supporting this event. And I would like to welcome Stephen Marston, Vice-Chancellor of the University.
Thank you, Ian. On behalf of the University of Gloucestershire, may I also welcome you to this very special event. These days, as a university, we are incredibly prudent and careful with our sponsorship money. But when the festivals approached us to partner with them on this event, we felt it was just too good an opportunity to miss. What we particularly wanted to do was to make sure that some of our students and some pupils from our partner schools in Gloucestershire had the opportunity to come along and to hear it firsthand from someone who can truly claim to have been one of the best known figures in world affairs for many years, Hillary Rodham Clinton. We've been able, through our sponsorship, to provide free tickets to 40 pupils from 9 partner schools and to the Gloucestershire Hospital Education Service, and we've been able to award tickets to 28 of our students from the university, including 8 journalism students who are here covering this as a journalism assignment. At the university, and I know at our partner schools, one of our central goals is to help our students gain an understanding of the world. The rhetoric of creating global citizens can get a bit overblown at times, but we think it is so important to encourage our students to become well-informed, engaged, and passionate about global issues and about how the world works. So what better opportunity than to be here today listening to the first-hand account of a person who has been a player on the world stage for years. What is said may give rise to lively debate. I rather hope it will. But the point is to lift our attention for a while beyond Gloucestershire and beyond our current Brexit preoccupations, to listen and learn about people and events that have shaped today's world. Secretary Clinton very generously agreed to meet both pupils from our partner schools and some of the university students, and what a brilliant experience that has been for them. And now, please welcome to the stage the journalist and presenter Mariella Frostrup, who is chairing today's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Save your hands. You've waited long, I know, and hard, and not for me, so save your applause. I am delighted to be here today, of course. I'm honored to introduce a woman who has dented the proverbial glass ceiling so many times it's a miracle she doesn't have permanent concussion. Her earliest ambition to become an astronaut may have founded on the response from NASA that they didn't accept girls, but early rejection clearly galvanized her resolve. She was one of just 27 women out of 235 law students in her class at Yale. Empty glasses of water, never helpful. The first woman partner at Arkansas's oldest law firm. The first lady to treat the position as work experience for the top job. After which she became the first ever female senator from New York. She was Secretary of State for President Obama, and most recently, the first woman ever to run for president, having won the Democratic nomination. It proved a ceiling too rigidly constructed, even for her famously well-coiffured head. And instead, Donald Trump took his seat in the Oval Office. Today, she's here to tell us what happened, which also happens to be the title of her latest book. And before she talks to me, she's going to talk to you a little bit and set the scene for the book and why she wrote it. Please give a perfectly mannered Cheltenham welcome for Hillary Rodham Clinton. Thank you so much. Thank you.
my goodness, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Well, Mariella, I am really looking forward to our conversation, and thank you all for that incredibly warm welcome. I know there are students here from the university and from other schools that I'm delighted are part of this event at the festival. I do want to thank Guy and George and the terrific team that put this together. The oldest literature festival in the world, as they reminded me before I came out. And I'm so happy to be back in the UK. It has a special place in my heart for a number of reasons. I came here first so many years ago, I barely recall, but it was with Bill, and we revisited a lot of the old haunts that he had as a Rhodes Scholar, and went all over the countryside, met incredible people in pubs. What happens in pubs stays in pubs, as they say. We came back after we were married and on a Christmas vacation, actually, in London, and we were strolling around Chelsea when we actually heard Judy Collins' version of the Joni Mitchell song, Chelsea Morning. And we decided that if we ever had a daughter, that's what we would name her. And so the circle comes fully around. Now, I'm not sure how many of you followed our presidential election, but I assume some, maybe everybody here. We also tried to follow, which was kind of confusing, your Brexit vote. And
I think we found your election equally so.
I know, Mariella, I mean, it was shock on both sides of the Atlantic and a lot of worry about the future, and obviously these are challenging times. I wrote this book, What Happened, in part because I wanted to draw out some lessons about what I think happened. There were a lot of questions after the election. Will America stand with our allies and friends around the world? Will we still pursue peace and prosperity and progress? I think the jury is still out in lots of ways in answering those questions. So when I wrote the book, people would ask me, well, how are you? I started saying, well, as a person, I'm okay, but as an American, I'm really worried. And I tried to make the book as much about the future as about the past, and I hope that it is both personally and politically useful. I want to quickly mention 4 lessons before I get into talking with Mariella. First, everyone gets knocked down. You may not lose a presidential election on the world stage, but everybody gets knocked down. And what matters, obviously, is whether you get yourself back up and keep going. And so when people asked me with great concerns on their face, how do you get out of bed in the morning? I admit there were times when it was really hard, and I talk about those times in the book. It really helped me to spend long days walking in the woods with my family and friends. I read a lot, especially mystery novels, which always, at least the ones I read, had good endings. I went into a frenzy of organizing every closet and drawer in my house, played with our dogs, did some yoga. Actually, I describe alternate nostril breathing in the book for anybody who wants to try it. And yes, had my fair share of Chardonnay. So I started an organization called Onward Together, which was intended to kind of support the activism and encourage these grassroots groups in our country who are standing up, speaking out, part of the resistance. It doesn't mean I don't still yell at the TV, but at least I'm trying to be purposeful, putting my energy into action on behalf of our values. So get back up, keep going, and do what you can to try to make a difference. Second, the only way we will get sexism out of politics is to get many more women into politics. And now, there's been research done in the United States, and I wouldn't say that it applies here, but let me just tell you what it concluded. And it's really clear. For men, professional success and likability go hand in hand. In other words, the more successful a man becomes, the more people like him. Well, with women, it's the exact opposite. The more professionally successful we are, the less people like us. I suppose some of you might have an inkling of what I'm talking about. Women are also seen favorably when we advocate for others, unfavorably when we advocate for ourselves. And that struck a chord with me because historically, people in America like me when I'm serving in a supporting role. When I'm First Lady, when I'm serving the people of New York, when I'm serving in President Obama's cabinet. But the minute a woman steps up, and certainly when I step up and says, okay, now I want a chance to lead, it begins to change. Now, I've been thinking a lot about your political system compared to ours. After all, you have a parliamentary system. You've already had 2 women prime ministers. And how come? Well, the best I can tell is that in the book I talk about emotional labor that women engage in. And when you run in a constituency, in a parliamentary system, you don't have to run nationwide yet. You get elected, then you work with your colleagues, and they see you as efficient, pleasant, a good person to have on their side, and someone who could be a party leader. That's a very different approach than what we do in our presidential system. So while the particular challenges may vary around the world, I really can't think, whether it's parliamentary, presidential, or anything else, of any woman in politics who doesn't have stories to tell, which is why I have a chapter called On Being a Woman in Politics. And I write about how, look, it does hurt when you're constantly under the barrage of attacks and questioning and the like. But I hasten to say there are many reasons why it is worth it, despite all of that, for being a woman in politics, because you do bring a perspective that is different. And I think that's really important. In our own country, we've seen in the last 8-9 months what happens when women are not at the table. One of my favorite memes of the last year has been a picture of a group of about a dozen white older men sitting around a table to decide what health services women are entitled to receive. And of course, if you follow American news, you probably saw that the Trump administration has just eliminated the right to birth control in our health system through employer-sponsored plans. So being in the room, whether you're a woman or a person of color, counts. And to quote Lin-Manuel Miranda from that brilliant musical Hamilton, being in the room where it happens, you're making government not only representative, but more effective. So representation matters. Now, thirdly, this book is the result of years of frustration with some of the challenges that women face in politics. That happens in a lot of other fields too, to obviously state the point. Just recently our U.S. men's national soccer team didn't make it to qualify for the World Cup. Now that was obviously really disappointing. The headlines all said things like, U.S. out of World Cup, forgetting that the women had won the World Cup. And it's a little maddening because the champion U.S. women's national team is still fighting for equal pay. So one thing I believe in and have advocated for seems pretty simple: equal pay, closing the gender gap in both our countries, finally. Now, the third lesson is this: the forces at work in the 2016 election are still with us. In the U.S., it was a perfect storm. Deep currents of anger and resentment flowing through our culture. A political press that told voters over and over and over again that my emails were the most important story of the century. The unprecedented intervention in our election by the director of the FBI and the information warfare waged from within the Kremlin. Now, what we've learned about Russian interference in the election is even more than alarming. It is a clear and present danger to Western democracy, and it is right out of Putin's playbook. We don't know everything yet, but here's some of what we know. We know that Russian agents used Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, even Pinterest, if you can believe it, to place targeted attack ads and negative stories, intended not only to hurt me, but to fan the flames of division within our society. Russians posed as Americans, pretending to be LGBT and gun rights activists, even Muslims, saying things that they knew would cause distress and concern. They even held phony demonstrations to try to draw more attention to their propaganda efforts. Facebook itself has acknowledged that it sold $100,000 in ads to fake Russian accounts during the election. Now, they had to know some of it was originally Russian accounts because the ads were paid for in rubles. But as time went on, they seem to have lost track of that. Facebook is facing lots of questions. Those ads were seen by at least 10 million people in crucial targeted states in the US. New research from Columbia University found that the content posted by Russian trolls and bots had been shared upwards of 340 million times. So this isn't just about what happened, it's about what's happening right now and what we need to do to prevent it from happening in the future, because the Russians are still playing on anything and everything they can to turn Americans against each other. In addition to hacking our elections, they are hacking our discourse and our unity, and all of this is playing out against a broader story. We are in the middle of a global struggle between liberal democracy and a rising tide of illiberalism and authoritarianism. Now, Putin has positioned himself as the leader of an authoritarian and xenophobic movement that does want to break up the EU, break up NATO, weaken the Atlantic Alliance, undermine democracy. And we're seeing ripples of this in right-wing populism and nationalism across Europe, and in the democratic backsliding in countries like Hungary, Poland, and some might even argue, perhaps now, in the United States. In Germany, members of parliament have been hacked by Russians. In France, Macron's campaign was hit by a massive cyber attack just before their presidential elections. Russian trolls even pushed incendiary social media posts during the recent Catalonian independence referendum, which is rocking Spain. Maybe you've even seen the ads in the London Underground from one Russian state-funded propaganda source bragging, "Watch RT and find out who we are planning to hack next." The fact is, they're also opening a new Scottish bureau. So, Russia's weapons of choice may not be tanks or missiles, but let me be clear. This is a new kind of Cold War, and it's just getting started. We may have, in the 19th century, fought wars on land and sea and then moved to the air in the 20th, but in the 21st, wars will be increasingly fought in cyberspace. And America, the UK, and our allies need to approach this threat with new courage and resolve together. Finally, the fourth lesson, which is close to my heart, is, look, there is no such thing as an alternative fact. The Russian disinformation campaign was successful in part because America's natural defenses had been worn down over years by powerful interests that wanted to make it harder to distinguish between fact and fiction. When leaders deny things we can see with our own eyes, like the size of a crowd at the inauguration, or they refuse to accept settled science, like climate change, it isn't just frustrating to everyone around the world who pride ourselves on trying to live in the fact-based universe. It's insidious and subversive to democracy. So where do we go from here? Well, I obviously don't have all the answers, but I wrote this book in part to lay out some of the questions and to provide my best understanding, to pull the curtain back on what I saw and experienced. But I do know this, when it comes to Russia, we need to get serious about cybersecurity, get tougher with Putin, stand up for democracy with all of the messiness that it embodies, and get to the bottom of what happened in 2016. I recently was at Stanford University talking about these threats, and I met the former president of Estonia, Toomas Andrikilvis, who has been warning about this for years now. And in response to news that Russia targeted NATO soldiers' smartphones, he proposed a global cyber NATO to present a united front in face of these threats. And he rightly points out, the liberal democratic West has been subjected to enough wake-up calls. And beyond that, here at home, in the UK, in the US, and democracies, we have to insist on truth and accuracy. We have to implore the press to help us. We have to hold them and elected officials accountable when they fail to meet that standard. And we must refuse to be silent in the face of racism, sexism, bigotry, or rhetoric intended to incite hate and violence, no matter where it's coming from or who it is directed at. And to have the courage to stand up for human rights and the forces of democracy in this crucial global moment. And as you can tell, I feel incredibly passionate about this, not just as someone who lost an election she thought she was going to win until the very last hours, but as someone who has served my country, who was privileged to be Secretary of State, who has a view somewhat unique, perhaps, of what we're up against. So yes, the election is over, but we cannot move on. We have to draw lessons from what happened in 2016. We have to work together, regardless of our party affiliation or our political leanings, if we believe in democracy, and to bridge the divides that are tearing so much of America apart and which I believe threaten to disrupt and destabilize Europe. So with that, Mariella, let's have a conversation.
You talked about alternative facts, and of course, Churchill very famously, straight after the Second World War, wrote down his account because he felt that by doing that, he would gain control of the narrative. I wondered if that was part of your impulse in writing this book. You'd gone through an incredible, hostile, vicious, appalling, incident-filled, bizarre election campaign, and you wanted to nail what the true story of it was.
It was absolutely part of my motivation. Shortly after the election, there began to be a lot of reporting and analysis that I just thought was missing the point. You know, the most common theme in those weeks and few months afterwards was this was all about economics, and it was all about economic anxiety among white voters in certain parts of the country. I didn't believe that was the only or even the best explanation based on what I had experienced, what I had seen in the campaign. And I wasn't sure I was going to write a book, but I was positive I wanted to understand for myself the best I could what happened. And in the months since, and in the book itself, the case is made that yes, of course, there was economic anxiety. There were reasons for that. It was legitimate. But in what we call exit polls, it was found that anyone who thought economics was the biggest issue facing jobs and income our country voted for me. So there was that disconnect. And instead, the other narrative began to develop that, well, maybe it was cultural anxiety, and by that, people afraid of immigrants, resentful of anyone getting ahead if they were not feeling similarly successful. And a lot of the most intensive analyses of voter attitudes and actual voting that came to light in the first 3-4 months of 2017 really did bear out that this was the biggest motivator for many voters. So yes, economic anxiety, one cannot discount it. There still is a lot of work to be done to get the economy working for hardworking people, to keep the middle class afloat, to narrow income inequality and the like. But the way that Trump as a candidate played on bigotry and prejudice and paranoia was a very important motivator. And so I wanted to understand that. And then slowly over time, I have to admit, I knew that the Russians had stolen emails from the Democratic Party, stolen emails from my campaign chair. I knew that they'd been dumped into the public arena by the Russians getting them to WikiLeaks, which I will just say has become almost an arm of Russian intelligence rather than an effort at radical transparency. You don't see them ever dropping anything negative about Putin or the Russians. Just keep watching. So we knew that that had happened, but we didn't fully understand the impact. And we were in the dark about the extraordinary misinformation, what we call weaponization of information that was flooding social media, not just in a visible way, but kind of dark posts and individual personalized messaging. So yes, I wanted to know what happened, and the more I looked at it, I thought I'd better write this down because I want this out there to be a basis for discussion and debate.
What about personally, though? I mean, do you think that writing this book in less than a year gave you enough distance to provide a balanced perspective? I mean, there are reports today, admittedly from Fox News and the Daily Mail, so not necessarily reliable, that say that your husband, Bill, on reading the book, said that you would sound bewildered, angry, and confused if you published it in the way that you were intent on publishing it. And you were at a very raw moment, personally.
Well, you know, with all due respect to those outlets, that's a flat-out lie. And I'm going to start calling things that are lies, lies. I'm not going to be sort of tiptoeing around about it. And there's a cottage industry. Actually, it's probably bigger than a cottage industry. It's maybe a village industry or a small city industry of just churning out lies about me and my husband, my family, my associates, et cetera. And my husband read every page of the book, gave me great editorial suggestions, said it was critically important to get it out. He was surprised that I was determined to get it out as quickly as I did, but he fully supported that, and he's very proud of it. So, look, this is what I mean about, I have no argument with people who have partisan views, as both of the outlets you just mentioned do, and they want to promote those views. But let's have some truth in advertising. We are for a certain political point of view. So therefore, take with a big grain of salt, or maybe a big barrel of it, everything we have to say, whether it's right or left. And it's unfortunate that that's now where we stand when it comes too often to the media in the United States and here and elsewhere. And it requires a lot more work by the average reader. So I wanted to be sure everything I've said in the book could be verified, validated. And you'll notice what they said was making up stuff about my husband's response, not one mistake in the book. That's a dead giveaway about what's really going on.
But it must have been a very traumatic period for you. You were 100% confident you were going to become president.
Yes.
You'd got the purple pantsuit for the first trip to Washington. You had the white pantsuit for the actual inauguration. And so the fact that in the space of one night, those dreams of an entire lifetime's career were shattered is very hard to encompass. The pain that you must have been going through. There's a line in the book where you say that, late that night, you and Bill finally went to bed. You lay in bed, hand in hand, and looked into the darkness.
Yes.
What were you thinking?
Well, I was just devastated. I'd been ahead. I knew we had a rocky time at the very end because of the Jim Comey, he was the FBI director, the letter that he sent to members of Congress that reopened an issue that had been closed and never has adequately explained why he did that. And
I was going to ask you, why did he do that?
Well,
and now I'm not going to ask you. I'll cross that one out too.
Well, I'll give you some theories, but it stopped my momentum. We came out of 3 debates, and I was generally judged to have won all 3. I thought we were on a path that would get us to the 270 electoral votes that we need in our system. And I think that the combination, as I explain in the book, of the Comey letter, which really did throw a huge chill over voters trying to make up their minds, who were maybe worried about a woman president, maybe worried about me, maybe worried about Democrats, maybe worried about, the kind of pressure they were under from those who didn't think they should consider me, whatever the combination might be. I don't blame voters. They have to digest the information that they get. But what I didn't realize at the time was the really effective, insidious role that the WikiLeaks weaponization of Podesta's emails played. Just as a quick example, in the book I write about one of the most consequential days of the election was October 7th. Remember, the election itself is a month later. Early in the morning, for the first time, 2 of our leading intelligence and security officials come out publicly and say it's absolutely provable that the Russians hacked the DNC, that they have been interfering in the election. They didn't go too far, but even that was kind of a bombshell for people to finally say, oh, it's not just the Clinton campaign saying it, there's proof that the intelligence and security professionals have. That was followed by the release of the Hollywood Access tape, where Trump admits to being a sexual assaulter, something much in the news today, but which, when it came to him, somewhat faded despite a dozen or more women coming forward. The Hollywood Access tape was followed within an hour by the first WikiLeaks dump of John Podesta emails. Now, at the time, I thought it was annoying, but I did not realize how effective those were being deployed and how they were being perverted. The most common example of that, also described in the book, was John Podesta in an email talking about going out and getting pizza at a local pizza place in Washington, D.C. Right-wing outlets began to say that that was code for a child trafficking ring that he and I were running in the basement of the pizzeria. I mean, it's laughable, it's horrible, but it's laughable. It migrated from right-wing outlets to Fox News, to Facebook, to appearing broadly on people's posts, on Twitter, all kinds of cooperative effort to promote this vile story, to the point that a young man in North Carolina sees the story online because it didn't have that much media exposure, because a lot of the media in Washington know the pizzeria, know there's no basement there. But it's all over social media. So this guy gets in his car, takes his automatic weapon, drives to Washington, D.C., charges into the pizzeria, thinking he's going to be a hero liberating the children captured in the basement, shoots the gun. Thankfully, no one is injured. But think about that. A story deliberately designed to peddle the most horrible stories, lies about me, provoking that kind of reaction, not just to discourage voters, but to inflame someone of mixed judgment, obviously, to do what he did. So a lot went on that last month, and I don't think it would have been enough, despite the Russians and the Trump's best efforts, and who knows, Cambridge Analytica and all these other groups that were involved. But the Comey letter sealed it, and the cumulative impact, we still have anecdotal evidence of people saying, well, you know, I couldn't vote for her after I found out what she did at that pizzeria. It's a frightening warning about the uses of propaganda and what are called, when the Russians used them during the Cold War, active measures to suborn democracy, to suborn leaders, to create false stories, all of which in a social media world have much more currency and impact. So yes, I thought I was going to win. I believed it on election day. I was with President Obama the night before in Philadelphia. He gave me a big hug, told me how proud he was that I had this. We all thought I was going to win. So this came as a surprise, and we're learning more as we go.
A surprise is a very lightweight word.
Came as a shock.
A surprise.
Yeah,
you know, that's
yeah.
like a birthday surprise.
No, it's like
It's not like a birthday surprise at all.
Not at all.
So, did you lie there thinking this has all been a waste of time, this entire career of
No.
mine, everything I've worked for? Or did you lie there thinking, I gave it my best shot,
No,
I'll have another go later?
No, I didn't think that. I lay there thinking, what happened? And, you know, that was a question mark. I think I've got the answers in the book, but I was at that moment just stunned. There was no warning of this. I mean, maybe one or two people predicted Trump might do better than anticipated. Even Trump was surprised. I mean,
did he sound surprised when you gave him a call?
he you know, I know from, you know, reporting since and what people who were there with him have said, you know, he was shocked. And when I called him, you know, it was perfunctory. It was painful for me, certainly. And, you know, but I did hope. Look, I mean, I've been involved in American politics for obviously some time. I hoped, okay, the man in the campaign will evolve into the president, you know, because people say and do things in campaigns that maybe are not fully reflective of who he ends up being. I feared that would not be the case because there was just too much about his character, how he scapegoated people, how he insulted and attacked people that bothered me. But I said, okay. I wished him well, said obviously I would help if there were anything I could do. The next day in my concession speech, I asked my supporters, who after all numbered 3 million more than his supporters, to be open to helping. And then, you know, I went home and just, you know, just collapsed with, you know, with real grief and disappointment. But I opened the book with the inauguration and the speech he gave, which was so dark, divisive, and dangerous, that those of us on the platform, because I was there not as a former candidate opponent, but as a former first lady. There's a tradition, former presidents and first ladies go, you show continuity regardless of what power.
And you were
is coming
reluctant
in.
to go, weren't
Oh, I
you?
did not want to go, Mariella. I looked for every reason to go. We called the Bushes and said, are you going? You know? And you know, and
No
the-
excuse presented
well,
itself.
the elder Bushes were hospitalized, I think, for real, and but the younger Bushes came, and the Carters came, and so Bill and I sort of sucked it up and did it. But you know, I write in the book that George W. Bush, who I was sitting next to, was reported to have said, that was some weird shit.
You clearly don't think that the current president's performance has improved since his electioneering. You described him as a sexual assaulter, amongst other things. We've seen a lot in the news in the last 2 weeks about Harvey Weinstein, who was a big Democratic supporter and a regular at the White House, and indeed, I think today has finally been ejected by the American Film Academy. And all of these stories seem to come to the same conclusion, which is that powerful men can use that power in ways that aren't always seen as being sexually manipulative, but actually are because of their position and so on. I'm a feminist and a huge fan of yours, but if you've ever let me down, it's been by not being sympathetic to the women who talked about having been hit on by your husband, and in particular a young intern who was in a very vulnerable situation with a man of power. I just wonder now, in the light of all the years and all the experience, whether you feel more sympathetic towards them.
Well, I will tell you that, look, that was a very difficult time during which my husband was held accountable, and in fact, both personally and politically. So I'm not going to revisit and relitigate it. It was all litigated during that time.
No, but I'm talking more about your,
well,
as a woman, as a
of
feminist, as probably the world's most famous feminist
That's true.
at the
Well,
moment.
I hope. I'll try. No, of course. Obviously, you know, the stories of the women coming forward now are, you know, reminders that this is not limited to one person in one walk of life. It is so common. And I think all of us have seen over the last 20 years how much more there has to be to support the stories of the women coming forward.
I guess that's why I'm asking you. I'm
Yeah.
asking you now if you would have responded to that in a slightly different way, knowing, as you do now, that, you know, women often don't come forward because they're not believed or
Yeah,
are
but
in a vulnerable situation.
there are different circumstances, and so let's leave what happened then for history and all that we know from it, because I do think that although each individual instance has to be judged on its own, the pattern, which is what I am focused on, has to have a bright spotlight shown upon it so that it can, you know, be a focus of people not only supporting the women, but sending a strong message to men, whether they're in power in Silicon Valley or in politics or entertainment or wherever they might be, that that is just intolerable behavior. And so I think that, I hope, I don't know if it is, because I went through an election where a man admitted much worse than often we see, and nothing stopped it. He talked about it as locker room talk, and people who wanted to vote for him accepted it. He has a long history of misogynistic and terrible things that he says about women, which does kind of set him apart even from some of the other instances that we know of. So I don't know if this is a turning point or not. I hope it is, because it's just, you know, got to be dealt with. And, you know, young women in particular have to be, you know, given the confidence and the support not to be intimidated or fearful. But I want to just add this, you know, the Trump example in the campaign, because you rarely get someone on tape admitting what they did. It could not have been any clearer. There's, you know, always he said, she said, and this and that, and all the rest of it people try to obfuscate. But with him, it was clear. But his dismissal of it, his total rejection, side by side with the terrible things he said, starting in the Republican primary debates to the only woman standing on the stage with him, or the woman reporter asking him questions, misogynistic, hateful attacks, really put it in a different category in lots of ways, and yet it had no consequences.
But isn't that the puzzling thing, and isn't that one of the things that you're puzzling as you write the book, you're probably puzzling while you were campaigning, is that in a way, what people voted for in the end was someone who seemed real, no matter how appalling his flaws and how little qualified he was for the job, instead of someone who they perceived to be presenting a perfect facade, and that something has changed in the political environment and indeed in terms of voters, where they would rather see that and see something that they feel is real than everything else that they presume not to be.
You know, it's a really important question, and I try to unpack it. I think it needs a lot more thought than I can give it in the book. Yes, there is this word authenticity. Now, I am authentically a reserved person. I am authentically a woman who was raised and came of age at a certain time with certain expectations. I'm authentically someone who has studied and watched and known presidents, and therefore have seen that what they valued was calm and composure and a certain level of presentation so that they wouldn't scare the children watching on TV. And yes, maybe all that is out the window now. And maybe it doesn't matter how real you actually are if you're not dancing on a table, insulting people, using every rude thing you say to act as though you are tearing down political correctness instead of being polite. Maybe all that's gone.
But is democracy still possible if it's turned into a talent contest?
That's what I'm trying to figure out, because you know, I didn't in my remarks, I didn't get into what I see as the first reality TV campaign and the first reality TV candidate. You know, Barack Obama is a very dignified, very controlled person. You know, he talks slowly, thoughtfully, measures his words. When I do the same, I'm inauthentic. And part of that is being a woman, because there is no overall image of what a woman president, commander-in-chief, head of state, head of government in our country looks like, since we haven't had one. But women are always judged more harshly and always given fewer, you know, fewer feet of margin to operate in.
But you've also had 50 years of kind of grooming to be a perfect politician. And in a way, that seems to be what people are reacting against. I mean, in this country as well, I'm not talking about just in America, and it's not personal to you. And sometimes one wonders whether, you know, playing the woman card during that election, even though it's very hard not to, being one, was necessarily the best thing to do, because you were the most qualified candidate. It didn't matter whether you were, you know.
No, I mean, it really is, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. When I ran in 2008, you know, I've only been myself in politics. I was always supportive, not just of my husband, but of other candidates and causes.
And as you said in your introduction, that is so much more acceptable.
Yes.
In a supporting role, you're perfect.
I really, really was perfect in a supporting role. And so, you know, I really, you know, in 2008 when I ran, some of the analysis was, why doesn't she ever talk about being a woman? Well, I thought it was self-evident, and you know, I talked a lot about my experience, some of which was highly informed by having been a woman. So when I ran this time, I was much more explicit about it and talking about, you know, what it meant to have a woman in the presidency, and I was very upfront about that. But I will say, it's hard to judge how that is perceived by everybody. Obviously, a lot of people liked it and were enthusiastic about it. Some people quite concerned, because we have research which shows that in the Republican Party in particular, a very significant percentage of both male and female voters don't particularly want a woman president. And for some who are motivated by ideology, religion, it's partly because they don't think that women belong in that position of power. For others, because somebody like me, as a woman, I bring my, you know, liberal, democratic, progressive values to the forefront, and they don't agree with that.
But also you bring your association with a past president and with the Democratic Party and with a long career in politics. And what it seems that voters were crying out for. And you even say in the book, you misread perhaps as the sort of primal scream of American voters, desperate for change, desperate for something different to enter into the political arena. And things like President Obama saying, you're the best chance we've got, Hillary, in a way, whilst that's incredibly flattering, could also be seen as sort of a nail in the coffin of your presidential campaign because it associated you too much with the past.
Well, I think all of those are legitimate questions that we should probe. I think I lost in the last 10 days of the election. So I was doing well enough to be the front runner, to be viewed in from many different perspectives as on my way to winning. But the points you raise are absolutely legitimate. And maybe it's because I am a mother and a grandmother. So when somebody says, I'm just so angry, I want to throw everything away, I can't stand it, I'm done with it, you go, okay, calm down. Let's deal with this. What are we going to do? How are we going to solve this problem? Rather than say, you're right, you should be even angrier, and you should blame the kid next door, and maybe you should blame his parents, and maybe... No, anger is not a strategy. So yes, I plead to the fact that I thought the demagoguery, both in my primary and in the general election, were really fueling a lot of views and positions being taken by people that were not in the best interest of our country. Because, while we see the headlines about things that are in the news and being covered wall to wall, we have 3.5 million Americans in Puerto Rico who are drinking polluted water because we have such a terrible indifference toward their plight by this president. We have thousands of homes being burned in Northern California and 400 people missing. We don't know their fate yet. Very little interest or concern. We go down the list of what I'd always thought a president was supposed to do. We have a president who pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement with no facts or evidence on his side. We have a president who's now trying to undermine the Iran nuclear agreement and therefore wants 2 nuclear confrontations at the same time. So I do think it's still important to be prepared and to have a level head and to make decisions that are based on reason and to try to help come to the right outcome. So yes, that is who I think I am, but that is also who I think leaders should be. That doesn't discount the anger, the resentment, the grievance that I saw firsthand. I thought, and perhaps was not effective, in saying, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And unlike my opponent, who just had rhetorical blasts, which were very attractive to people, I said, okay, I understand this. I understand what happened during the financial crisis. I understand where we are now. We have a long way to go, and here's what we're going to do if we work together. Maybe not as titillating as it needed to be.
You call the book What Happened, but I suppose the question that burns is what happens next? Because if you think of voting in Trump as a sort of last-ditch primal scream, as you described it, people are angry, people are desperate, they want change, and that doesn't come about, and very much a lot of his presidency so far seems to be just about dismantling what went before rather than creating anything new and constructive. What happens to America when those very people who voted him in and saw him as the possibility for change, what happens when they are even more disillusioned next time around?
That's really, it's really a very difficult question to answer right now. His approval rating has dropped to, depending upon what you look at, 30, 34, 35%. Those are people who are not going to leave him because they do feel that when he goes after black athletes who are kneeling to protest not our flag, not our anthem, but racism and injustice, that he is beating up on somebody that they think deserves it. And he is going to continue to play to his base. We saw it most horribly after Charlottesville, with our streets in that beautiful city filled with neo-Nazis and white supremacists and Ku Klux Klan members, and he couldn't bring himself to criticize them even after one murdered a young woman by driving a car into her. So there will be a hardcore that sticks with him because he answers some of their unfortunately, deepest, darkest feelings about others, about our country, about the world as it is. The popularity of Putin is rising in the Republican Party. You know, they view him as a white supremacist, authoritarian, who gets to do things that they approve of. He has
Gets things done.
Gets things done. He wages a campaign against gays. He, you know, invades countries at will, takes them over, or at least the parts he wants. You know, so there is a reaction on the part of a certain segment of our population, but we saw it in the German election, first time right-wingers will be in the Bundestag, that people do want to just throw it all out. The messiness of democracy, giving everyone, regardless of their race or their ethnicity or their sexual orientation or their religion, an equal vote about our future, they reject that fundamentally.
But the problem is, if you're saying everything right and doing everything right and people still don't want it, what does it mean?
Well, I'm not going to talk just about myself. There are other people who will run, who perhaps will be, especially after this experience with Trump, be able to get a broader electorate. But let me just say a word about the part of the electorate that we, you know, everybody talks about and we lost, and that's white voters.
And particularly women.
Well, you know, yes. I mean, I won women voters, and I won by a very, very narrow margin white college-educated women, but I lost white women overall, 53 to 47. And people say, how could that happen? Well, I got more white women votes than Barack Obama did in 2012. So this is not just a Hillary Clinton problem, it's a Democratic Party problem. And part of it is the ongoing debates that we have pitting Republicans against Democrats, and Republicans are just masters at creating anxiety, cultural anxiety of all kinds, and playing on fears and insecurities. So we need someone who, yes, can break into that. But there are two other big issues that can't go unmentioned. One, there was an enormous amount of voter suppression in this campaign. We didn't know how effective it would be until retrospectively, but somewhere between 100 and 200,000 voters in Wisconsin, one of the states I narrowly lost, were turned away at the polls. And there's been a lot of good reporting about them, people showing up with identification, but not exactly the right identification, and being sent home, primarily African Americans and young people. So the Republicans have tilted the playing field quite dramatically in terms of what's called gerrymandering, you know, drawing the lines to elect more Republicans in states, even though Republicans versus Democrats, the Republicans get fewer votes, and then actually suppressing voters. And the other piece is that a lot of our base voters, young people, people of color, you know, people in more optimistic areas, because remember, I won the areas of our country, where two-thirds of the economic growth is taking place, our gross domestic product where it's growing. You know, obviously on the coast, but in addition, you know, states like Illinois and Minnesota and blue areas within red states where there's a level of optimism and confidence about the future. So we've got to do a better job of sort of harnessing that and convincing people that we do have a better path to the future. It may not be immediately as emotionally satisfying. You know, I mean, one of the things that President Obama had to do when he inherited a terrible economic disaster was to fix it without scaring the heck out of people. But the reason that a lot of people walked away from him in metaphorical ways and then in terms of voting and support is because he didn't give them the emotional gratification, the catharsis they needed. And I think that was one of, you know, the problems that I faced in trying to succeed a two-term president of my own party, which is historically hard.
I've got two more questions, and then we've got 4 questions from the audience. So I'm going to try and speed us through them, because I don't think I can let you go. We're here in the UK, and we do care about the American election, but we care more about ourselves.
Yes.
And of course, foreign policy was not something much highlighted during the election campaign, but it's certainly where the rest of the world, I think, feels Trump's effect most perniciously. You mentioned, you know, his walking away from the Iran nuclear deal, and there's also his constant, little fracas with Little Rocket Man, which is probably one of my favorite terms, I have to say. But it nevertheless does destabilize the world as we know it. Do you think we should be very afraid about his policies, if they are policies and not just reactions? And what would you be doing differently? I mean, you talk about the Russians and their influence in the whole emails and so on in the American campaign. But of course, the Iranians have just been revealed as having hacked into UK MPs' accounts last June. So it's everyone's at it.
That's right. Well, except us.
Well, we'll
No,
probably find out you guys all were as well at some point. The world is full of disappointments.
No, I think it's fair to say that certainly, historically, both the UK and the US have certainly collected information and used it for intelligence purposes. But I have advocated that if we are going to be in the age of cyber warfare, we have to have a deterrent to it. There has to be consequences for it. President Obama imposed sanctions after the election on Russians, but right now we have President Trump, who was forced to sign a sanctions bill from the Congress because the Congress is at least worried about Russian behavior. So he signs a bill to enforce more sanctions, and then up till now he has not enforced it because, as I said in the third debate, he's actually Putin's puppet when it comes to a lot of foreign policy.
But are you more worried about Russians in cyberspace than you are about Kim Jong-un?
No, I'm worried about all of it. No, that's why, I mean, look, it takes a steady hand, and it takes a willingness to devour information to get the best analysis you can to try to make good decisions. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but at least you have to put the work into it. That's not what's happening with Trump. It's all visceral. It's all reactive. It's all, personal pique. So he goes after Kim Jong-un on Twitter, which is like giving Kim Jong-un the biggest gift he could ever get. And instead of supporting a diplomatic effort, he undercuts his own Secretary of State, telling him it's a waste of time to try to get the Chinese, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and others involved in trying to contain, deter, rein in this nuclear threat. Very dangerous. And if there is a ballistic missile that can carry a warhead that can threaten any American territory or our allies, which include South Korea and Japan, we are treaty bound to respond. So yes, it's very dangerous. Then he compounds it by pulling or trying to pull us out of the Iran deal, which he doesn't do but suggests be done, and throws it to the Congress. Now, that is deeply disturbing because I started the negotiations with Iran when I was Secretary of State. Our goal was to put a lid on the nuclear program. We know Iran still engages in bad behavior. They've hacked, targets in the United States, and we now know about the UK. They promote aggressive behavior. There's a lot of bad stuff that they do. We know that. But we would rather, I thought, deal with that without worrying about the centrifuges running again in underground, undisclosed facilities. But what Trump may be doing is tipping the balance in Iran back toward the Ayatollah, away from the civilian government, so to speak, which was the one that did negotiate the agreement and convince the Ayatollahs to go along with it. And if that happens and Iran gets back into the business of producing enough enriched uranium for a weapon, then we've got two dangerous potential conflicts. And of course, we have long-term dangers like pulling out of climate change, like now looking as though he's going to pull us out of NAFTA, which is with our two biggest trading partners, being dismissive of Europe in so many ways. Yes, I'm very worried because we have so many actors on the world scene right now who want to destabilize, disrupt democracy for their own purposes. And we should not be trying to make it easier for them. And that's what I think Trump is doing.
I know there's not much to laugh about, but occasionally he even makes me chuckle. And I wonder if he does you. If there's anything, I have actually brought you a book just published by Canongate called The Beautiful Poetry of Donald Trump. I think you're going to really enjoy this. the picture particularly, it's Donald Trump's head imposed onto Dylan Thomas's body. and these are poems created with his tweets, with his speeches, with his attacks on you. I think you'll even find there's one about you in here, but I'll leave it to you. Anyway, I did want to ask you, that's present, I did want to ask you if he has ever made you laugh out loud. I mean, North Korea, bad.
Only to keep from crying.
Healthcare, complicated.
Oh, man, I'll tell you, yeah. Healthcare is complicated. I didn't know this job would be so hard. That's my personal favorite.
Is that your favorite?
Yeah.
Just finally, well, I think, you know what, all I was going to say is if there's an upside, you're clearly an incredibly effective campaigner. And in fact, for me, the book really comes alive when you're talking about the actual causes that you're incredibly animated by, rather than the ills and wrongs done to you. And in particular, you were so brave when you went to talk to the coal miners, you know, when you dealt with the whole issue with the poisoned water in Flint, and the work you've done over many, many decades with children and with women. So is there a sense now that you don't have to be political anymore, and you don't have to rein it in, and you can do and say whatever the hell you like, though it probably takes a bit of getting used to, that you can be even more effective in civil society, and that actually it might not be a bad thing?
Well, look, I would much rather be in the White House.
I'd love it.
Yes,
yeah,
I would. That's just a fact. But I am going to do everything I can on behalf of causes and candidates I believe in. So I'm not leaving politics because, you know, in our system, our best chance to rein in the excesses and abuses of this current administration is to take back one or both houses of Congress in 2018. And that's something I hope to help people do. So I have a lot to say. I will continue to say it. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not shutting up and sitting down. I have to say, you know, when some people in the press started saying that, I just did a little Google search, you know.
It's dangerous.
I said, yes. I said, did they say that to Al Gore or John Kerry or John McCain or Mitt Romney? And the answer, of course, was no. I thought, there we go again. And I was with the absolutely extraordinary Mary Beard the other day, and she was telling me about this. She said, from the very beginning, as far back as the Greeks, women have been told to shut up. And I said, well, Mary, give me an example. And she goes, in the Odyssey. I said, well, yeah, that's pretty far back. She tells a story about how Penelope, you know, is sitting there knitting, literally knitting together the regime of her husband, Odysseus, as he's trying to get back. Took him an awfully long time. And so she is expressing some opinions. And her son, who has now grown to be a teenager, says, shut up, mother. Speech is not for women. I thought that was profoundly interesting and applicable.
So what would you say to Chelsea if she said, you know what, you've dented the ceiling, I think I can crack it?
Oh, no, she is doing great work on her own. I'm saying this to a lot of young women. I'm running a program to support their work. I'm trying to recruit more young women to run. I'm trying to help train them. I'm trying to help them grow skin as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. I'm trying to help them understand that no matter what their hair looks like, it will be criticized. Don't worry about it. You know, just little tips that I've picked up along the way that might be useful. If you want to wear flat shoes or, you know, running shoes or kitten heels, whatever you want to wear, just go ahead and do it, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, don't clap yet because I'm going to hang on to Hillary for another couple of minutes. I wonder if we could raise the house lights because we've got Jane Padham, who's a third-year media student at the University of Gloucestershire, who was selected to be the one questioner from the audience because she was top of her class. And Jane, is it possible to see her? Is it possible to raise the lights? She's right there. Oh,
well, we can hear her. We can hear her. We can hear you, Jane.
Hi, good afternoon. How can we encourage more young women to get into positions of power where they can change the world for all women?
Well,
globally?
Jane, I hope you're one of them. I hope you're asking that question on behalf of yourself and your classmates and every young woman. Okay, I just want to put this in a broader context, because we have to start with young girls early to build their confidence that they can pursue their own dreams and ambitions. But in our country, at least, by the age of 6, little girls start thinking that they're not smart and they're not as smart as boys. Now, most educators will tell you that by the age of 6, it's pretty unclear who's going to be a top student and who's going to be smart, because kids are, just basically learning the very, rudiments of reading and writing and the like. So this really starts in families and starts in communities, to be sure that young girls and then teenagers and young women are given the support that they need to try different things, to try on not only different potential paths of interest, whether it be journalism or politics or business or academia or medicine or whatever it might be, and not to be discouraged, because it really does come down in many ways to confidence. Now, I will be quick to say that if you are confident in public as a woman, remember what I said in the very beginning, as you get more successful, you get more unlikable. But it's pretty hard to do anything if you're not confident. So you got to figure out how to maneuver through that. And I think schools have a particular opportunity to give young children the chance to have their own voices heard. I was in Wales yesterday, and they're trying a really interesting experiment in Welsh schools, and I met with a couple of the students. They're having like school assemblies, little mini school parliaments, where girls and boys are being given the opportunity to be voted in, to take on projects, to have their voices heard. One of the young girls told me that they're building a new comprehensive school, and the children have actually been asked for their ideas, and some of the ideas have been quite good, like, that hallway's too long, I can never get to my class, something that maybe an architect might not necessarily recognize. So the more we can empower voices of both girls and boys in equal settings, so that boys get used to hearing girls' voices express opinions about issues, so that when a girl says something in a meeting, or even a grown woman, as I've personally experienced and seen, that it's almost a cliche where you say, I think we could take X and Y and put them together and get a great Z. Nobody pays attention, and then 10 minutes later, a man says, I think we could take X and Y and put it together and get a great Z. What a brilliant idea. And so we've got to get both our young men and young women to realize we are all in this together, and we need to be getting the best talent and the best energy behind solving any of our problems. Then obviously, in our country, we've knocked down a lot of the legal barriers. When I was Jane's age, there were schools I couldn't attend, there were jobs I couldn't get, there were scholarships I couldn't apply for. We've knocked most of that out. But the attitudes linger. And it's really deep in our human psyche about the proper roles for women and men, and the limited room for maneuver that most women are given. And so we have some work to do on ourselves, and that's women judging women as well as men judging women. And I think there's a real opportunity now, and certainly in the months since my election, so many young women have stepped forward, and my heart just really swells. They're so brave. They step forward and they say, I'm going to run for office someday, or, I'm going to go for that job or that raise that I think I deserve. And we have to support them and do what we can. And the final thing I would say in the business world, because far more women will be in business than will ever be in politics, we have a lot of evidence now from companies that have been honest enough to look at themselves that gender pay differences are real. For the same experience, the same education, even the same quality of reviews. And I really applauded there were like 2 big Silicon Valley companies. One I know quite well, Salesforce, run by a wonderful man, Mark Benioff, who took the challenge to find out whether he had pay equity or not in his company. He assumed he did because, that's what he believes in. And the people who were working for him all swore they were sure they did. Women and men in the very beginning of their careers start off equally on the pay scale. And then by the end of their 20s, young women have fallen behind. And when put to the test, and I looked at this report, when put to the test, no supervisor, male or female, could explain why it happened. How did this happen? She has a PhD in computer science, he has a PhD in computer science. What were the intangibles? And I know from my own experience, it goes back to some of what Mariella was asking me earlier about how you present yourself. I mean, I've always thought if I just worked really hard, that would be recognized. And for much of my life, that has been true. But I remember very well working on a really intense legal project. And literally, we were at the office for 12 to 18 hours every day for several months. And there was an older, experienced lawyer. He was about 5, 6 years older than me. And, one more time, I was staying in. I wasn't going out to dinner. I was working through dinner. I was determined to, get this right. He stopped by my office and he said, well, why don't you come to dinner? And I said, I just don't have time, Evan. I've got to get this done. I'm, really intent upon getting it finished. He goes, he said, you go out to dinner with me, then you come back, and you walk through the halls and you say hello to everyone, and they think you've been there the whole time. That's one of the tricks nobody told me in law school. So I just think that they're attitudinal and other approaches that can help crack the code for more young women. But in order for that to work, they have to step forward and be willing to try. And it takes a certain amount of courage to do that.
Hillary, if I don't stop you soon, I'm going to be having my own personal travel ban from the United States of America. So can I turn these last 3 questions, because they are all from young people, and I know they really want to ask them. Can I turn them into almost yes-no answers?
Sure.
Because otherwise your team will,
Right.
You know what it's like. So Olivia Scull, who's another student at the University of Gloucester, wants to know what you think of NFL players taking the knee, and I think you've sort of answered that anyway, but will you keep that in your head?
Yes.
And then Daffy Griffiths, who's 17 from Newent Community School, wants to know if you share Barack Obama's views on tighter gun control. And Lucas Hancock, who's 18 from Tewkesbury School, wants to know if you believe religion is too influential in American politics related to such issues as abortion.
Oh, well, quick answers.
Just whistle stop.
Well, I support the right of athletes or anyone to protest peacefully. And what was lost in the Twitter storm by Trump, and meant to be lost, is that these athletes were not protesting our anthem or our flag. They made that very clear. In fact, kneeling is often seen as a sign of reverence. They weren't turning their backs, they weren't walking away, they were kneeling. And they were doing so to try to draw greater attention to the continuing challenges that we have with racism and injustice in our criminal system. And it was perfectly legitimate, and no one should be offended by it unless they are choosing to be offended by it, and unless their president is telling them to be offended by it, because it is within the full ambit of peaceful protest, which I absolutely support.
Okay, let's do it like Trump would. Gun control, good, bad?
Good.
Good.
Good. And
Okay.
good. And I will make sure you're not banned, I promise. I have a whole chapter in the book about gun control and about people who have been affected because they lost a loved one to gun violence. And I have now met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe now into the thousands over 25 years, of family members of victims of gun violence. And the NRA knew that I would be a staunch supporter of common sense gun safety measures. and they spent $30 million against me. A little reported fact that had a big impact in some of the places that I lost, because it was clearly meant to scare people in totally unrealistic ways. And you know, in America, the vast majority of Americans support certain forms of gun control, and a big majority of gun owners do. This is a powerful lobby that represents gun manufacturers first and foremost, that is in bed with the Republican Party, who will do nothing, no matter if 6-year-old children are slaughtered, or concert goers are slaughtered, or people in a nightclub are slaughtered. We have four people counted as a mass shooting in America. So if you kill 4 people or more, that's a mass shooting. We've had 274 of them this year alone. So 33,000 people a year die from gun violence in America. That includes murders, suicides, and accidents. And it's outrageous that we can't have sensible gun control. And I'm still going to keep fighting for it.
That's a good. That was definitely a good. Just finally, and as briefly as you can, do you believe religion is, this is Lucas Hancock's question from Tewkesbury School, do you believe religion is too influential in American politics, particularly as related to issues like abortion, but yeah, just generally?
Well, look, I think that there are sincerely held religious beliefs that people have every right to have. But I have long supported what we call in the United States a woman's right to choose in the most intimate areas of her health and well-being, and that to deny that choice the way that Trump is moving us toward, and to appease people whose views are very fixed, is putting church over state. Because if you do not want to choose to make a personal choice like abortion, you do not have to choose. I've been in countries where you were forced to have abortions, like China 20 years ago. And I've been in countries that forced you to bear children, like communist Romania. And I've been in countries where birth control is available to the wealthy and not to the poor, and women die in trying to obtain an abortion. So we know the facts and statistics, and making abortion legal, safe, and we were making it rarer and rarer. That's what's so horrible about what Trump is doing now. I've been fighting against unwanted pregnancies through birth control and working with teenagers and trying to help women make the right choices for themselves for years. And now they're trying to take away birth control from so many women. So there's something both political and perverse about it, and using religion to justify it. And I find it deeply distressing, but it shows that double standard at practice again, because none of the health plans that Trump is proposing have done anything to limit Viagra.
I think you'll find there's a poem in there about Viagra, which you'll enjoy. That's for your granddaughter. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to be patient. I know you've been incredibly patient already, but if you could just stay in your seats for a couple of minutes while Hillary leaves the building, just because there's, stuff that has to happen. Thank you. And also then your bags will be ready with your copies of your books that I know you're all dying to get your hands on. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for being incredibly patient and warm and wonderful and welcoming Hillary Rodham Clinton, to whom we're very grateful.
Thank you.
For coming here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's so dark, I can't see it.
I know, it's impossible.
So great. There's that great sign back there.
I know, I'm quite liking that heart.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Careful, the steps. Yeah, I think they're coming the